We are used to living with monuments. Monuments are bearers of memory, whose origins are manifold and whose makeup varies enormously. If we were to place monuments on a scale according to what they say, it would range from the playful and naive to the fitting, the bizarre, and even the sad, as well as from the mocking to the threatening and even the alarmingly martial. Particularly after military conflicts, memorials often arise on both sides as reminders, with the feeling of mourning often abused and the dead being mourned politically exploited. This is a worldwide phenomenon. After decades of peace, the First World War meant a drastic and dramatic break at all levels of everyday life. The elegant and glittering Belle Époque was also overshadowed by dangerous political purposes that slumbered in the ideas of the later part of the 19th century. Expansionism, colonialism, imperialism, and nationalism had all made their eerie mark. In the interwar years, this explosive mixture steadily prepared the fertile ground in the world economic crisis for racism, anti-Semitism, and the next World War. On 23rd May 1915, the Italian government, without any need, declared war on Austria-Hungary. It was a war of aggression, triggered by territorial, imperialistic, and opportunistic longings. In order to gain territory and to expand its sphere of influence, particularly on the Adriatic, the country was propelled into an appalling war in which over 680,000 Italians lost their lives and more than 900,000 were wounded. In contrast to Welsh Tyrol, today's Trentino, where the majority was Italian-speaking, in the case of South Tyrol there was absolutely no justification for the war as a return home of a large ethnic group in the sense of the Irredente, Italy's unredeemed lands, because in 1915 only about 7,000 Italian construction workers and craftsmen lived in South Tyrol, i.e. just 3% of the population. During the war, Austria in vain offered Italy a new frontier to be fixed at the Saloon Gap and along the language border to Welsh Tyrol. The 1919 peace negotiations of Versailles were based on the 14 points of the American President Woodrow Wilson, according to which the political reordering of Europe had meticulously to respect the language borders. But the reality turned out rather differently. Deliberately ignoring the armistice of 3rd-4th November 1918, Italian General Armando Dietz occupied southern Tyrol without resistance up to the Brenner Pass and proudly declared: "Una volta arrivati lassù al Brennero, nessuno ci caccerà via così presto." Once we get up there on the Brenner Pass, no one will chase us away from there any time soon. His words were both bitter and momentous. Notwithstanding the protests of the German and Ladin-speaking populations concerned, of their Austrian homeland, and even some of the British delegates, southern Tyrol, from Saloon up to the Brenner Pass, as set out in the Secret Treaty of London, was in 1919 awarded to Italy. Hearing of this contradiction of his 14-point programme and its defiance of the language border, Woodrow Wilson supposedly apologised with the words, "I was not really in the picture." South Tyrol was, so to speak, the consolation prize for the areas of Istria and Dalmatia offered to Italy by the Entente, as compensation for its treacherous change of sides and entry into the war against the German Reich and Austria-Hungary. The reason being that these areas were now to belong to the new kingdom and later state of Yugoslavia. Italy's dreams of becoming a great power on the Adriatic were miserably dashed. The First World War thus ended with Italy on the winning side, but the triumph was nevertheless a socio-political fiasco. The Italian population lamented a vittoria mutilata, a mutilated victory, with 680,000 dead and 900,000 wounded. When, on 10th October 1920, Italy, already infected by fascist ideas, ratified the annexation of South Tyrol without a popular vote, the yoke of Italian foreign rule was forced upon the South Tyroleans, whereas Welsh Tyrol had only just shaken off a similar form of paternalism. The South Tyrol problem was born. Even before its seizure of power in October 1922 and the establishment of the PNF, Partito Nazionale Fascista, the Duce had recognized the demagogic potential for his interests that lay in victory celebrations and the veneration of warriors. Solidarity with the ANMI, Associazione Nazionale Mutilati e Invalidi di Guerra, the National Association of Wounded and Disabled War Veterans, was thus a skillful move. It now became a worthwhile goal for the new fascist movement to emphasize an absolute willingness to make sacrifices. The official line was in fact to promote the heroic status of the war dead and political martyrs, men like Cesare Battisti, Fabio Filzi and Damiano Chiesa, starting with smaller projects. All this was the object of a stylized idolatry of the fallen, a morbid veneration of the dead, in addition to the subject that had recently been introduced into schools. Educazione fascista, fascist education. Entirely in keeping with this demagogic atmosphere, on 4th November 1921, the remains of the Milite Ignoto, the unknown soldier, were transferred in a specially decorated train from Aquileia to the Altare della Patria at the Vittoriano in Rome. This, the altar of the fatherland, now permitted the regime to bend the canonization of the fateful self-sacrifice of the First World War to its own interests. The Church had no objection, and indeed, assigned a joint responsibility for the dead, now played its own role in the macabre scenario. The prelude, as it were, to the state-sponsored cult of the dead came in 1923 in the form of the first large military cemetery on the previously heavily contested Colle Sant'Elia near Redipuglia. The graves of fallen were concentrically arranged in steps, as in an arena, around a chapel and an obelisk, alternating with the wearer's amulets and personal items of equipment, such as steel helmets, mess kit, daggers, cartridge magazines and wire cutters, together with patriotic poems to their mothers and to the fatherland. The aim of this dubious form of martyrization was to make the Vittoria Mutilata more acceptable to all. The memorial was inaugurated in the presence of Mussolini on 24th May 1923, the anniversary of the Italian attack. The original memorial in 1938 replaced a Parco delle Rimembranze, a park of remembrance. Along a rising avenue of cypresses are now stone markers with the above-mentioned items and inscriptions. On the summit of the hill, since then, has stood an old Roman column, flanked by a number of mountain guns. All monuments fundamentally have just one purpose: to gain the attention of the viewer and express their message. A time-honoured way of achieving this is the mythological romanticizing that gives the monument a religious nimbus, establishing its legitimacy on the ground and cloaking it with a mantle of inviolability. While the first monuments and cemeteries were modest in size, from 1928 onwards, General Giovanni Varracovi initiated a systematic plan for the establishment of enormous memorials, to which the mortal remains should be transferred from the innumerable small cemeteries. Varracovi also stressed that ease of access and, if possible, a railway connection was necessary, so that the mass of the Italian people could at least once in their life visit these holy places as devout pilgrims. The memorials should thus be few in number, but truly monumental in stature. What was new, however, was the name for the proposed ossuaries, which now acquired a new status as sacrari militari, military shrines, an ingenious, if inadmissible, neologism. After the transfer of the mortal remains of 272,095 combatants, General Varracovi boastfully remarked, "Italy will once again have shown that she is, as always and throughout the world, truly a model in every area of culture." None of the military shrines visited during filming mentioned the fact that Italy had launched a war of aggression. Quite the reverse. The one-sided historical picture, that of a legitimate defence of the fatherland, is offered up to the children who come here on school trips. Italy's historically proven aggression is not mentioned, as the temptation to bask in complacent nationalism is too great. Entirely in keeping with the manner of the ancient Romans, to increase the grandezza, a skillful selection of inscriptions, forms and symbols is used to effectively focus the attention of visitors on the monument's message. Alongside materials such as stone, marble, iron and bronze, it is the rational style that above all sets the architectural tone. We will now give a chronological overview of the establishment of the memorials, ossuaries and monuments to the dead. A peal of bells ushered in the succession of monumental memorials. The Bell of Peace, cast in 1924 from the bronze of First World War guns, was consecrated on 24th May 1925 in Trento in the name of Maria Dolens. The bell was to sound 100 times every evening in remembrance. In 1926, the next military shrine was built along the front line from Rovereto over the Pian delle Fogazze to the hotly contested Monte Pasubio, housing the mortal remains of 13,000 dead from both sides. The architect, Ferruccio Gemello, erected a 35-metre high monument of ashlars over an ossuary chamber and a chapel. A number of cannons located in front of the monument recall the battles of the era. Especially worthy of note is an information board for the Pellegrinaggio Nazionale Anna, the Associazione Nazionale Alpini, inviting former members of the Brigata Cadore on Saturday, 5th September 2015, to a pilgrimage to honour the fallen, with flag raising, speeches, mass, lunch, laying of a laurel wreath, and concluding fanfare. While of itself nothing unusual, this is not a matter of a pilgrimage to the holy martyred dead, as confirmed by the regime at that time by oath, and now perpetualized 100 years later. Numerous visitors come on remembrance days, many not just wearing their Alpini hats, but also in battle dress, arm in arm with their wives, holding their children by hand. On the 28th of September 1929, the shrine on Monte Cimone was inaugurated near Tonezza. In the bitter fighting for the strategically important peak, the Austrians placed 14,000 kilograms of explosives under the summit and blew up the entire 1,210-strong Italian Sele Brigade at around 5:45 a.m. on 23rd September 1916. Over the following 10 years, monumental structures were built at another 11 places. In the years 1932-1936, on the high plateau of Asiago, close by the infamous battleground of Monte Ortegara, the ossuary of the Sacrario del Leiten was constructed for 54,289 dead of both sides. A 47-metre high triumphal arch rises over a square, 80 metres by 80 metres, that contains the crypt and chapel. The urns are kept on the inner walls. The Austrian punishment expedition of May to June 1916 alone saw over 82,000 men listed as missing. Over 20,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers were also moved here in 1938 from surrounding graves. In 1933, in the presence of the king, the Sacrario Militare Fagre della Battaglia on the river Piave was inaugurated. The four reliefs of the first monument to the heroes of the Piave, erected in 1919, are today housed in niches on the structure, which is in the form of an exedra. The motifs signify: Italy enters the war, 24th May 1915. Enemy barbarians violate the fatherland, 24th October 1917. They shall not pass, 15th June 1918. The triumph of Italian arms, 3rd November 1918. The four anti-Austrian German reliefs were in fact removed by the Wehrmacht during the German occupation, but hidden by their curator. In a side wing is also buried an American medical officer, Lieutenant Edward McKee. He was a personal friend of Ernest Hemingway, who dedicated a poem to him. Hemingway was himself slightly wounded and taken to a military hospital in Milan to recover. Here he began to write his novel A Farewell to Arms, published in 1929, a love story between the American ambulance driver Lieutenant Henry and a Scottish nurse, Catherine Barclay, which also considers the sense and nonsense of war. Over 10,000 dead lie in Fagare. On a wall, saved as a museum piece, is the famous saying, scratched by soldiers, "Meglio un giorno da leone che cent'anni da pecora," better one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep, a phrase often later quoted by Mussolini out of context. Nearby, at Nevesa della Battaglia, the architect Felice Non in 1935 built the Sacrario del Montello. A high tower, visible from far away, dominates a wide stairway. It recalls an ancient fortress and is the last resting place for 9,235 soldiers. The Sacrario Militare di Pocol, built in 1935, contains the remains of 37 Austro-Hungarian and 9,707 Italian soldiers. It is located at an altitude of 1,535 meters, close to the Falzarago Pass near Cortina. Engineer Giovanni Raimondi built a 48-meter high structure in a seemingly strictly rational style, whose characteristic feature is an almost uplifting strip of vertically arranged, multicolored glass blocks. 2 Alpini guard the entrance. The Ossuario Italiano del Monte Grappa, containing 12,615 dead, and the adjacent Ossuario Austro-Hungarico del Monte Grappa, with its 10,295 dead, confront visitors equally with the cruelty, incomprehensibility, and questionable nature of war, alongside the justificatory cult of the hero. Here, in 1935, architect Giovanni Greppi and sculptor Giannino Castiglioni created an expression of a macabre demagogy in an orgy of ashlars, whose message is that death is a fine thing, leading up the steps to the light, to the chapel of the Madonna del Grappa, and from there, along the Via Eroica, the Road of Heroes, to the Portale Roma, where death, church, and state hold hands in a fatal inversion of values. The building activity continued apace. In 1936, the Sacrario Militare del Tonale was built according to the plans of the architect Pietro del Fabbro for 847 Alpini who fell between Val Camonica and Val Vermiglio. The monument consists of a square crypt with urn niches on the walls and an altar with the risen Christ. Outside, 2 stairways lead to the bronze statue of the Victoria Alata, a copy of the Roman original in the museum at Brescia. The shrine at Caporetto, Gobarid, Cafret was built in 1935 to 1938 according to the plans of Giovanni Greppi and Giannino Castiglioni. Here was the scene of a particular catastrophe for the Italians. At daybreak, a 4-hour attack began using 900 gas grenade launchers. Over 40,000 Italians had perished in the devastating phosgene clouds that rolled over their positions. When, in September 1938, Mussolini personally inaugurated the memorial, he made no mention of the poison gas, as he had recently used this several times during the war in Abyssinia. Between 1936 and 1938, on the Colle Casteldante in Rovereto, a large ossuary for 20,000 Italian and Austro-Hungarian dead was constructed. Here too are buried the patriots Fabio Filzi and Damiano Chiesa. The Sacrario Germanico di Passo Pordoi, located at an altitude of 2,239 meters, was built in 3 phases. Construction began in 1937. It was continued from 1956 by the German War Graves Commission, and the opening took place in 1959. Here are buried 454 German and 8,128 Austro-Hungarian soldiers from World War I, as well as 842 Wehrmacht soldiers killed during World War II in the area around Belluno. Despite the fact that no fighting ever occurred here, in 1937 it was decided to build the Sacrario Militare di Colle Isacco at Gossensas, close to the unjust border, as a further act to legitimize the Italian position by means of an obvious historical falsification. A Roman column, a flagpole, a wall of urns, an altar, and the inscription, "Holy is the path that the soldiers trod," are all intended to suggest to the visitor that this border was paid for in blood. The mortal remains of soldiers who had died in faraway combat zones were in fact moved here without any justification. In the First World War, 1,357-metre Plöckenpass on the ridge of the Carnic Alps soon became a theatre of war. Both sides dug in, and bitter positional warfare began. 1/3 of the war dead were victims of avalanches, which were triggered as a weapon. After the war, the Italians set up a monument to the Alpini on the pass. In 1936 and 1937, not far from a road that from here runs down to Tolmezzo and Udine, the regime converted the Santuario del Cristo chapel into the Tempio Ossario di Timao, where 1,764 Alpini and 73 Carinthian riflemen are buried. In 1937, in memory of their mutual brotherhood of arms of 1917, and at the same time as the Italian monument at Pligny near Verdun, the French built the Sacrario Francese di Pederobba. It was here that, on 30th September 1917, 863 Frenchmen died recapturing Montitomba. The monument is beautifully designed. Before a long wall of ashlars is a metre-high group of figures, a sitting French woman and an Italian mother, weeping for the dead French son resting on their legs. Built in 1938 on a hill on the east bank of the Isonzo, not far from Gorizia, stands the Sacrario Militare di Oslavia, a monument to 57,000 dead that was built to the plans of Gino Venturi. Here, the bell, the campana chiara, was originally to ring every evening. After some years, it rang just once a week, then once a month, and finally once a year, until the mechanism failed. A shortage of money means that the bell is today silent. The year 1938 also saw the consecration of the Sacrario Militare di Pian di Salese, Col di Lana, the work of Giovanni Greppi and Giannino Castiglioni. This is the last resting place for almost 5,000 soldiers. The location, known in Ladin as Fodom, in German as Buchenstein, and in Italian as Livinal Longo, is one of the 5 Ladin Dolomite valleys, together with the Val Badia, Val Gardena, Ampezzo and the Val di Fassa. It lies between the Podoi Pass in the west and the Campolongo Pass to the north. To the east is the Col di Lana, partially blown up during the war in the Dolomites, and the Falzarego Pass. Until the First World War, Buchenstein belonged to Tyrol and Austria. It was evacuated by Austria at the beginning of the war. The localities in the combat zone were heavily damaged. Together with South Tyrol, the area was given to Italy, and in 1923 attached to the province of Belluno. In the course of the compulsory Italianization, in Belluno, Mussolini publicly declared to the Ladins, who were not recognized as a separate ethnic minority, "O vi assimilate, o vi sterminerò." Either you assimilate, or I will exterminate you. If the people of the valley get their way, however, the communities of Livinal Longo and Colle Santa Lucia will again become part of South Tyrol. The Sacrario Militare Germanico di Quero, Colmao, constructed in 1936 to 1939, rises on a hill near where the Piave exits the mountains and joins the Treviso plain. It was designed by the German architect Robert Tischler, subsequently the creator of memorials at Tobruk and El Alamein, who also completed the building works on the Podoi Pass. The monument to the dead at Colmao is built from porphyry blocks from the Rolle Pass. All of the 3,461 soldiers are buried in a communal grave under a stone slab. At the centre of the complex, on an altar, is a book of gilt bronze listing the 865 German and Austrian dead known by name. Wall mosaics depicting military comradeship adorn the room. A swastika at the entrance was later removed. Giovanni Greppi and Giannino Castiglioni were in 1938 also commissioned to create the highly impressive Sacrario di Re di Puglia, facing the Sacrario di Colle Sant'Elia. This is a solemn and serious resting place of 100,187 dead. Guided by a strict perspective, the visitor's view is focused on 3 crosses on the horizon, with stairs leading up to them. On 22 rows, in ascending alphabetical order, lie 40,000 of the fallen. On the base of the axis lies the 75-ton porphyry sarcophagus of the Duke of Aosta, commander of the Italian Third Army. Significantly, the last shrines were built in South Tyrol in 1939, in completion, as it were, of the rampart of the dead and as justification for the contemptuous Italian seizure of German and Ladin-speaking Tyrol. The court favourites, architect Giovanni Greppi and sculptor Giannino Castiglioni, were again asked to build the Sacrario Militare di Passo Rezia. The 312 dead buried here at Bourgais were officially moved from disused cemeteries from 10 places in the upper Finchgau Valley, The truth is, however, that no Italian soldier ever entered the Upper Finchgau during the war. It was on the Ortler Massif, not at the Reschen Pass, that fighting took place. As at Gossensass and in Bourgais, in 1939, the regime once more employed the same falsification with the establishment of the Sacrario Militare di San Candido. There was no fighting at Innechen. The 218 Alpini buried there were apparently all exhumed from somewhere on the mountain front and then transferred here for political effect. Contemporary history does not forgive lies, however. It mercilessly unmasks them.